Lovely. So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We run a monthly Elevate Sustainability webinar, which focuses on various different topics. And today we're going to be looking predominantly at green tech. So I recognise a number of names that are on the call today, but for those of you watching online or who I haven't met before, my name's Ilona Alcock. I'm Director and Co-founder of Elevate. We're a business development consultancy focused on innovation, community and sustainability. And those three pillars came from a mix of what were we really passionate about, what were the topics that we wanted to talk about, that we wanted to build up more of a reputation in those areas, but then also what is it the businesses were coming to us with, what were the issues that they are talking about and that they really needed to have more support on. And it will come as no surprise to you that sustainability has gone higher and higher and higher up that agenda. It's gone from being something that a few people who really kind of cared about energy were chatting about to suddenly something that every single sector is looking at how to be more sustainable and how to reduce their carbon footprints. The reports coming through from the IPCC are fairly angry in tone, it has to be said. We are kind of getting to the point now where it's like, it is now or never. We've had a lot of warnings about this. We've had a lot of, in the next 5 years, in the next decade, by 2050, we have to do these things. And it is now very much like, it is now that we have to start making some huge changes. And green tech, and particularly around our digital footprint, is something that in a lot of ways can be seen as a real positive, as an alternative to things like flying around the world. Being able to jump on a Zoom call is obviously massively reducing our carbon footprint. But the tech industry does come with its own carbon footprint, and it's not necessarily being designed in a way to keep those emissions as low as possible. So I'm going to allow both my panelists to give themselves their own introductions in a second, and then we're going to talk through a few of the issues that are coming up around the digital carbon footprint, around the emissions from the tech industry. If at any point you have questions and you want to know a little bit more, please do just bob them in the chat function. I'll pick them up as we go along where appropriate, or keep them to the end if it's something to pick up there. And then we will open up to Q&A at the end of the session. So if I could come to you first, Colin, just to let everybody know who you are and where you come from.
Okay, so my name's Colin Riley and I'm based up in Glasgow. I have a company called Lesser Panda, and basically I specialise in making websites as efficient as possible. So reducing the weight of the pages of the website in order to reduce their carbon footprint. And I do that by looking at it in a number of ways, by making the code that the website runs on very efficient, reducing unnecessary code, and optimising things such as images and so on the websites to make them more efficient.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Colin, and incredible business name. Absolutely loving that. If we have time at the end, I'm definitely going to want to know the story behind that. So coming to you next, Pete.
Yeah, hello, morning everyone. So I'm Pete Coulter from a company which is a much less cooler name, GFT, and it's a German company, so I'll not even attempt to tell you what that stands for. We are
I assume it means no Lesser Panda in German.
Yeah, I just tell people it stands for great flipping tech, but it doesn't. We are a digital and transformation.
I've just lost your sound there, Pete. We trialed this in the tech beforehand and everything ran absolutely fine.
You know when I said I had new
earphones might let us down.
You know when I said I had new headphones?
Yep.
Let's get rid of them.
That's not always the answer.
Get rid of them. There you go. So yes, digital transformation consultancy. We help other companies build digital and web products. We have an initiative internally called Green Coding. And it's kind of, I only joined the company in January, but it's really sort of triggered my interest in sustainability because a lot of my previous companies didn't really look at it, even though it was the same technology type companies, they didn't really take into account sustainability. So interested from that angle.
Wonderful. Thanks ever so much to both of you for joining. So as a bit of a starting point then, how bad is the carbon footprint of the tech industry when you've kind of started looking at it? I did a little bit of research on this, and the figures are all over the place, depending on where you look. So it seems to be around 3 to 4% of global emissions attributable to the tech industry, but the projections then went wildly different. So some were saying that the communications industry is projected to be 20% of global emissions by 2025. Others saying by 2040, we're looking at 19% coming from the tech industry. Some saying that we're looking at this kind of 9% growth year on year, but just massively, massively different. Have you got kind of any figures that you work towards that are potentially a bit limited? I can see Colin nodding there. What are your figures? And
yeah, one of the values that I've used regularly was a report by the Boston Consulting Group, who estimated the carbon output of the infrastructure of the internet, so excluding your own laptop or smartphone or whatever, just the infrastructure to run the internet has a current carbon footprint of about 1 billion tons of CO2. So that's in the region of double the airline industry at the moment. And as you say, the figures do vary an awful lot, and the rate at which it's due to expand, the figures on that are very, very different. And it depends who you ask. The good news is, in some senses, that recently, even though the use of the internet has been increasing, the number of people connected to it and the amount of things that run on it, while that has been increasing, the carbon footprint or the CO2 output hasn't to the same extent. And that's mostly down to more efficient servers and data centers becoming, as the data centers become larger, they become more efficient, and also because less companies are running individual servers in their offices and they're running stuff on the cloud instead. And generally just the sort of economies of scale, that's more efficient. So in recent years, even though the amount of traffic on the internet has been going up, the carbon footprint hasn't. So in more recent studies, people are less pessimistic. I know that you mentioned there someone's talking about 20, 30, 40% of CO2, but currently what I've been reading more recently is people are more optimistic about it than those figures.
We like a bit of extra optimism there. And I think what's really interesting, as soon as we start projecting in percentages, is we're also trying to second guess what's happening in every other industry. So it's not necessarily that it's increasing that much in its carbon footprint. It might just be that the other ones are coming down, so it's then responsible for more. So it's not the most useful gauge of what's going on. Pete, are you seeing similar trends there around kind of increased efficiencies, particularly around kind of large data centres and the way that large organisations are managing their tech and comms?
Yeah, I mean, data centers, and I noticed there's a question gone in chat there specifically about data centers as well. And I think data centers are interesting, as Colin's alluded to, that they're big, power-hungry beasts, right? And they're essential for the modern internet. In terms of measuring it, though, that's where it starts to get really interesting, right? So internet traffic generally, since I know we're going deep on internet here, right? But let's stick with it. So internet traffic, I think, since about 2010 has gone up 30% every year on year. So right. In 10 years, it's about 17-fold increase in internet usage.
And I imagine the pandemic certainly continued.
Yeah, so 2020 was up about 40%, right? Because everyone's streaming videos and stuff like that in a single year.
We all discovered Disney Plus, and that was it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. So, but what's really interesting is so you've got internet usage has gone up, internet traffic's gone up to a proportion of that. Data center energy use is flat since 2010. It's nearly 100% flat, right? Which is really interesting because you automatically assume, well, if that much more traffic, and to Colin's point, the people who work in these data centers, right? They're not small companies. These are big companies with a lot of smart people, and they're using technology and data to improve their own operations and their own performance, first of all, which is incredible to be able to process that much data. By the way, this excludes crypto, these numbers, because that's a whole
I was going to come on to crypto later.
Yeah,
it's definitely not the lower energy efficient side.
Yeah, again, and that's where you get into energy use versus energy source as well, which is a really interesting conversation point. Yeah, data centers are actually a great example of how tech can improve things. And I mean, that's improving itself, it's sort of self-healing. But when you talk about the general numbers of what's the impact of digital, and we talk about these percentages of carbon emissions, like you said, the numbers are all over the place, because how much of that carbon is green carbon, how much is fossil carbon, how much has it reduced and helped, how digital technologies helped other industries to actually reduce their output? So it could have had a net benefit, but pulling all this data together is really, really hard actually. And when you go out and start looking at it, I think I found the same as yourself, that just you start getting very opinionated pieces with lots of varied numbers. And I feel like we're in almost an educational phase where we're trying to baseline some measures and some data so that we can actually all know what's going on. I think there's way too many opinions out there and sort of deliberately controversial pieces from both sides of this argument. So yeah, I think overall, it's definitely got a footprint, and I think we can safely say that footprint is not all coming from green energy. But data centers in particular, I think are a great example of a success story. And Google, they're going at it. We did a talk with Google about a month or so ago now. They're trying to get to not just carbon neutral, they're trying to get to 100% renewable energy by 2030 in their data centers, 24/7 round the clock, which is incredibly ambitious. And they're going to have to change the infrastructure in certain countries around the world to do that. But that's part of their mission, which is great.
Amazing, thank you. I've just seen it pop up in the chat saying define green carbon. I think that was literally just a slip of the tongue there, that we meant green energy as opposed to.
No, I deliberately meant green carbon. So
green
carbon. So yeah, no. So green carbon is carbon that's produced through the natural process, right? Which is
right. Okay.
So if you burn fossil fuels, fossil carbon, right, which is not something that naturally goes into the environment. If a animal dies and decomposes, it releases carbon. That's green carbon. That's perfectly natural. So that's the difference between green and fossil carbon.
Perfect. Thanks ever so much for that. Wonderful. So we see like those data centers then that were becoming kind of more efficient and also moving more towards those renewables. And I think my internet is struggling here. I'm just going to hotspot for you here. Give me 2 seconds and I will be back. Wonderful. We're now hotspotting, which unfortunately is not as energy efficient as connecting on Wi-Fi, but unfortunately what we will be doing for the rest of this session. So when we're looking then at things like crypto, we know that they are incredibly energy intensive and they're growing. Is that something that we're trying to track separately, or is this something that is kind of, we're just not quite sure what's going on there? And either to Colin or Pete there.
Not an area that I know much about, so I'll leave that to Pete.
I mean, I feel like no one really knows anything about crypto. I feel like everyone just pretends they do and we're all fine.
I think, well, I mean, again, I'm not an expert on crypto, right? But we can talk about it what at a high level. We know crypto's energy intensive, right? Just the nature of it. If you think back to how crypto started with people mining on their own PC, it became sort of gaming PCs that had graphics cards that could do the mining more efficiently. Those things are going to burn a lot of energy, right? They do. As a gamer, I know my computer burns a lot of energy. I think one of the interesting things with crypto, though, is this is where you start thinking about source of energy versus use of energy. So there was China, I think a few months ago, right? They banned crypto mining in mainland China, and that saw crypto mining go to other countries like the US. And China is has a big push on green energy, right? And renewable energy. It has one of, I think, the largest onshore wind farms are in China. I think we've got the largest offshore. But that saw a massive increase in the sort of fossil carbon output of crypto in Bitcoin mining, because it was being done with more green energy in China versus more sort of dirty carbon in the US and other places. So a lot of this comes back to the source, and that's where I think we have to use technology. Crypto is a fascinating technology for those who don't know much about it, right? It's just a really interesting way of having currency is just one example of how you can use the blockchain and distributed ledger technologies. So it's a great technology and we should use it, but we need to use it in a sustainable way. And it would be great. I think the key thing for me is when we start introducing new technologies, if there's almost an expectation or a standard that we start with green in mind. And that's going to take significant change from both businesses and governments to actually define some standards around what that means. But, you know, imagine if there was a V2 of, or one of the new cryptocurrencies even that's coming out, you know, they're all slightly different. If one of them, and I'm sure there is one that's probably boasts that it's 100% green, I think that's a really good starting point, because the use of energy, the source of energy is really important, as well as the use. And we'll get onto the use, because I know Colin and I both got initiatives to talk about the use of energy, but the source of energy is really, really important. And I think that was a great example where the source changed for the far for the worse.
Absolutely. So what would be kind of really interesting, following on from that, then, is because one thing you mentioned is about not having this objective standard, and pretty much anything that we talk about in sustainability, that kind of comes back to being part of my issue, is there isn't an objective standard. You know, occasionally people are officially brought up on greenwashing as kind of saying that they're one thing and they're not, but actually there's a great kind of like muddy mess in the middle, and it's quite hard as an individual consumer or as a business to be like, no, actually this is the best option for me, they're actually doing what they should be doing, these are some practical steps that I can take. So what would you suggest, and I'll start with you, Colin, because you obviously work quite closely with your clients on this point. What are the kind of steps that as a business you can go like, right, I want to reduce my carbon footprint, I want to be more sustainable, here's some practical steps that I can actually do?
So normally when it comes to the web design side of things, this is how we start the discussion. Is I speak with the client and say, you know, do you have a goal for how efficient you want your website to be? And we can start with what the average size of a web page is, which nowadays is just over 2 megabytes, and say, okay, that's the average size on the internet. Do you want to be 50% smaller than that? Do you want to be 75% smaller than that? And we start by setting a target for how efficient we want their website to be. Now, as you said, there's no standards for what is right, or, you know, you can reduce it by 90%, or you can reduce it by 10% and say that you're being green or more sustainable or more efficient. There's no rules around that at the moment. There's no regulations. So it just comes down to how you best decide to do that. And then, yeah, I'll work with the clients to sort of fit to a budget. And basically, that's kind of the best way to do things, is to sort of look at what is happening in the industry at the moment, look at some examples of good green websites, see what bases they're using, what sort of budgets they're using for their website in terms of the number of megabytes per page, and use that as your starting point, and then kind of work towards that. So in some ways, it's kind of amongst people who are creating websites to be more sustainable, that they're kind of looking at what everyone else is doing and trying to set our own standards of what we think is kind of appropriate, and make websites to that sort of standard.
Fantastic. So as somebody who's not involved in web design or coding, what's the actual difference to me as a business if I want to make my website more sustainable? What are the things that you would recommend that I do, and how noticeable is that to the user of the website, or would you just not know at all, it would use in a very similar way?
So ideally, the user won't really notice at all, other than the fact that the page should load much faster. There's benefits, there's twofold benefits to doing this. So first of all, the page should load faster for the visitor. So depending on which sources you read, sort of average loading times for web pages are around sort of 2 seconds nowadays. Again, it depends who you ask. And it's said that most internet users will not even look at a page if it doesn't load within 3 seconds. So if it's not fully loaded within 3 seconds, they just ignore it. And some people have an even shorter attention span than that, to sort of 1 second. If it's not loaded, they're gone. So
I feel like he's a 1 second and you're out kind of guy.
Basically, like, ideally you want your web page to load as fast as possible, because then your customers are actually going to look at it. So the faster it loads, the more likely you are to engage your customers. The other advantage is that with recent updates to the algorithm in Google, is that they're looking at web pages and saying how fast do they load, and they rank web pages higher now that load faster. And they also specifically rank web pages higher that are optimized for mobile phones, because now, certainly in the UK, more people access the internet on their phone than they do on a computer. So there are multiple benefits, not only the green benefits, but there's benefits to your customers in that the page will load faster, and there's benefits in that you will rank higher in Google or various other search engines as well, which means that your customers are more likely to find you, or your customers can find things that's useful to them more quickly. So there's benefits on that side as well. In terms of how you go about it, it's mostly down to choosing how to present web pages. So a large percentage of the weight of a web page is down to images, and images are really important because we know that customers engage much better on web pages that have images. But thinking about how you use those images or the file formats that you use for the images can be really important. So for example, it's very common to go onto modern websites now, and the area above the fold, which is the area that you see immediately when the page loads, that is quite often now like a full size image. So it will take up all the space that you can see, and it will have some text on it telling you about the website. You can think about the way that you do that. You could have a similar effect, but with a much smaller image. So you could just have the text on the left, and then you could have an image on the right, rather than the image taking up the whole space. That'll be a much more efficient image. It'll be a much smaller size. Therefore, you'll start to get the benefits that we spoke about. The page will load faster, it'll have a lower page weight, therefore it will be more environmentally friendly because of the reduced transfer of data. So that's the sort of things that I would be looking at. JavaScript is another big thing as well, which if you're not sort of into web design is probably not something that you'd be as familiar with. But lots of modern websites use JavaScript to make them do fun and interesting things when you visit them. And JavaScript is becoming more and more common on websites. And a problem is that it's used excessively now. So trying to cut back on that as well is another big part in terms of reducing or making pages more efficient.
Fantastic. Yeah, so really interesting there that there's kind of some essentially a bit of an audit of your website, but one of the questions that quite often comes up in any area kind of sustainability is, like, how am I going to get sign off from this for the right people? So actually it's just such a strong commercial driver there to be like, actually, if you make your website run faster, more efficiently, do this, it's going to be better for your customers. It's the right thing to do for the website, and then also has this kind of great sustainability element to it as well. Pete, what kind of advice would you give to businesses who are thinking, wanting to reduce their tech footprint, or even kind of internally with GFT, what kind of strategies are you putting in place?
Yeah, so I guess if we stay on so there's probably a whole bunch of stuff that's outside of digital and tech immediately, but affect businesses, right? So like your office environment, how green is that, all that sort of good stuff. I think if we stick on the theme though of tech, which is what this call's about, and in particular building your products and platforms and apps, Colin's touched on a lot of what's really important at the minute in terms of efficiency. So way back when I used to write code, which was a long time ago, I'm sure you won't believe that, compute and hardware was expensive, right? And we used to deploy applications to computers, not servers and worldwide data centers. And you had to be really efficient in how you built programs. And I remember writing, I used to work for an airline, and we wrote this beautiful looking app, desktop app for the call center agents to use. And we thought it looked great, right? Sitting in our little office on our very powerful development PCs. And as soon as we put it into the call centers, the thing would hardly run, and it wasn't even usable, right? And that's because we hadn't thought about the hardware consideration. So we had to rewrite a lot of that and rebuild it. Today, compute and hardware and memory is you turn a virtual dial and you get more of it. And it's got to the point where some of our practices certainly in software engineering have become, I won't say lazy, I'll say suboptimal. And we kind of just take what we can get, and we're not thinking about the efficiency of it. And to Colin's point, JavaScript and the multitude of JavaScript libraries that are available to developers today to just pull down and almost copy and paste don't promote good coding practices for efficiency. And if we're talking about reducing energy use, so if energy is the amount of time something runs for times the power that it uses for that run time, then things that use less power and take less time are going to be more energy efficient. And those practices that we used to use are actually really relevant to do that for different reasons, right? It was hardware restrictions that we don't have, but now it's about reducing energy consumption. So we need to bring a bit of that thinking back, to be honest with you. So that needs to come back in. So good practices, and that's one of the things we do. A little bit of self-promotion is we teach our software engineers how to think about things like that. image sizes, as Colin said. Don't pull down huge images if you really don't need to. Turn your non-production servers off. Even if you're developing, right, if you're a project manager and you're building a website, you might have a list of 100 features. Do you need 100 features? Because building 100 features, you're not just thinking about the runtime energy use of an application or a website, you're also thinking about how much energy to build the thing, right? Yeah. If you're using carbon-based electricity for your office to build something, or your home to build these products, the more you build, the more energy you're going to use, right? So you've got to think about leaning down that bit of the process as well, and build less. So build less and give more value to customers if you can. So we try and encourage it under this green coding banner, which is our internal initiative to train our people, which we can then hopefully go when we go out to work for our clients, that we help educate them on those practices as well if we can. And then right down to the nuts and bolts, again, as Colin said, JavaScript, right? There's some interesting information out there about if there's any techies in the crowd about which languages are most energy efficient and which ones are not. And generally, for the nerds in the crowd, obviously the interpreted languages are less efficient than the compiled ones, because they've got the extra bit in the middle to actually interpret the code down to the machine level. So actually your language choice when you're starting to build an application is really, really interesting as well.
Amazing, thank you. I've just seen Dawn's popped in the chat the link through to some of your green coding initiatives there. So if anyone wants to kind of, there you go. We've got those nerds on the chat who want to dig a little bit deeper. I'm definitely going to be one of those afterwards, having a look through. What's a couple of things that you mentioned there that I just think are worth picking up on. The first is when we kind of said we're just going to ignore this chunk of stuff that's actually you as a business. And I think it's really important that that becomes part of the conversation, because I think we almost talk about tech in isolation and kind of say, you know, it's the internet, it's what you're using, it's what you're developing. And we kind of forget that actually tech businesses are businesses, that they're buildings full of people in a lot of cases. But also we're kind of in this weird place now where every business is a tech business. So, you know, I'm business development consultancy, but I launched in a pandemic, you know, bizarrely have ended up being very much an online hybrid business that we didn't see before. So it's kind of both of you then, in terms of the conversations that you're having with businesses, does this tend to fit into kind of a bigger drive towards sustainability and kind of opening up those conversations across the businesses?
Yeah, certainly in my experience, it's at some point in the business that they've sat down and they said, okay, you know, we want to make our business net zero, or we want to have a handle on what our carbon output for the whole business is. And they come to me and they say, okay, we've done, you know, based on our vehicle fleet, you know, how many cars we have, how far they drive, whatever. We've done it based on our heating, and we've done it based on our air conditioning, and so on. And we've got a handle on those, and they're quite straightforward. Next thing that we have is our website, and we don't really know how to classify the output of this. Can you help us with that? So I will look in and have a look at their website, have a look at the individual page weight of each pages, have a look at the number of visitors, and try and put a number on that for them, and then look at that and say, okay, this is what it is at the moment. Here are some of the things that I think you could do to make it more efficient, and this is what your number would be. So yeah, presenting that to them, and like you say, that's normally they've sort of started to think about that when they've been thinking about it as a company as a whole. It's not normally the sort of thing that people come to you about first.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of, we're on that kind of drive anyway, and then it's kind of, here's a section to look at. Yeah. And when you've worked on a website and reduced the kind of carbon footprint and increased the efficiency, is that promoted within the website? Is that something that the businesses are keen to kind of share with consumers and end users, that's happening?
Yeah, very much so. Most of the companies that I have came to are very much, they tend to be advertising the fact that they are aiming to be, you know, more sustainable, to be 100% carbon neutral or so on. So it's definitely something that they are often quite keen to promote, that they've done, that they've looked at. They can say that their website is more efficient than, you know, however many percentage of other websites, or it only produces so many grams of carbon dioxide. So yeah, it's normally something that they're quite keen to advertise once they have a handle on what it is.
Fantastic. And I think that really reflects, doesn't it, that as consumers, either as an individual consumer or as a business, we're starting to look for these things to help us kind of make those decisions. Coming over to you, Pete, one of the things I'd be interested in is we know that, you know, there is a skills gap. Recruiting tech people is very difficult. GFT launched in Manchester last October, obviously doing great work, employing more people now in the city, and so some really ambitious plans for growth. Does that green coding initiative help you to bring people in? Are we finding that developers are actually keen to work for places that are more sustainable, that are involved in that agenda?
Short answer is yes, it definitely helps, because it's something that people are getting much more emotive about and care about these days. I haven't really noticed the generational gap that I thought I would see in that interest. I think it's pretty broad. Yeah, we were, when we were at the Digital City Festival, we went strong on our green coding brand. We had a very green stand, and we got interest from every demographic, age, gender, whatever you name it, was interested. It wasn't sort of, it didn't polarize us to just say have a particular group of people who came up to us and asked us about it. So it's definitely something that people want to hear more about. You know, people want to think that the company they work for actually don't just treat it as a token gesture, they're actually doing something about it. Yeah. So I think that's really good. And it definitely helps from a talent attraction point of view, for sure. I think if I can just jump back on one of the points that Colin was talking about there as well, was in terms of, I think it would be great if, for example, the problem is at the minute is we don't have standards, is one of the problems, right? We don't have standards. As a consumer myself and a heavy user of tech, I think it would be great if there was some standard, a bit like, you can go and buy a washing machine, right? It's going to have an energy efficiency little tag on it. There's no reason why the App Store, Google's App Store and the iOS Store for Apple can't have similar rankings. They could create a benchmark to test apps for energy efficiency, and they could put that stamp on them. They could do that fairly quickly. I think that would be fantastic. The EU, or well, not that we're in that anymore, but we could introduce something potentially, similar to the directive around cookies when they came in, and payment service directives, to say, actually, if you're putting a website out to an EU user, it has to have an energy efficient tag on it to give the energy, and we could have a benchmark, and it would start something. And I think that's, you can do a lot of reading on this stuff and get overwhelmed with it and go, actually, well, what can little old me do right about this? But the reality is these little changes, these nudges would help us a lot, I think, in the longer term. So I'd love to see something like that brought in, when there is a standard that we can adhere to, where, companies like Colin's company and our company can objectively work towards an energy efficiency rating for products would be fantastic, I think. And I'd love to see something like that come in to make it a bit clearer for everyone, to be honest.
Absolutely. And I think that's it, just because as a consumer, how do I know? How do I look? And if I've got choices to make, there's certain things now where that carbon footprint is visible, and I can start to make choices, or just where it's really obvious that, like, well, if I buy this and it's reusable as opposed to disposable, that's going to be my better option. There's some kind of clear choices there. Yeah. But we know that whichever bit you look at, like, those choices aren't necessarily as clear. You haven't got the full amount of information. Yeah.
Interestingly, by the way, the French government seem to be a little bit ahead of this. So that last year they announced that they were going to introduce a bill that looked at a few different factors about the environmental impact of digital and technology. And one of the things they talked about, which I've not seen if it's progressed yet, if I'm being completely honest, is they wanted to have a framework for digital design. That was sort of mandatory for anything that was going to be presented there. So yeah, and there's an education piece and a few other bits. But so and again, it's going to need something like that, I think, as well. I'd love to see something like that could actually help us all work towards a common goal, or have a common standard to really drive behavioural change.
France has definitely been seen as leading the way in that tech for good space, and was kind of doing some large scale conferences with kind of the big global players, even going back a few years before kind of everyone was talking about this. So some really interesting work going on there. We focused a lot so far on the kind of the internet, the infrastructure, the digital side of things, but we all need a device to be able to do this. So Colin, when you're talking to people about their websites, does that veer into a conversation around the devices that they might be using kind of within their organisations, or that consumers might be using to access, or does that kind of sit quite firmly outside your remit?
Generally, that's more outside my remit. I get questions about hosting, what would be the best solutions for where to host the website, and also quite often questions about storage. So is it better to store things on hard drives, or is it better in the cloud? If I'm going to keep it in the cloud, is there one place that's better than the other, and so on. So sometimes questions about that. One interesting question that I've had as well was around video calls. So what are the carbon footprints of video calls? So that was quite an interesting one. So I made a little calculator for that one that I can share as well, that gives you an idea of what the carbon footprint of a video call is, just for interest. And you can compare it to how far you would need to drive in a car relative. So it can show you the benefits of video calls as well.
Yeah, it is really interesting. One of the things we chatted about with video calls is, again, if the comparison was I going to fly around the world and do this, amazing. But could it have just been a phone call? Like, did that meeting need to happen at all? Did it need to be, everybody in the company with their cameras on? And it's that once we get that new technology, sometimes we forget that there was a less technological way of doing it. So just on those couple of questions that people come to you with, if you are trying to offer advice on hosting or on kind of where to store on the cloud, is there kind of some general advice that you can give, or would it depend on what the consumer's wanting to do?
So generally, there's a couple of things to think about. There are options for green hosting available now, and they're becoming much more common. There are also some options to have green hosts in different countries as well. So there's different ways that you can think about hosting and how the electricity is used. So, for example, in the UK, whilst you can have a green host who's based in the UK, they are still just taking the electricity from the national grid. And as the grid becomes greener in the UK, then the carbon intensity of the grid decreases. But ultimately, there's a finite supply of electricity that goes into the grid. So the more and more electricity we pull out of it, that either has to come from green sources, or it's just made by turning up the power coming out of a nuclear power plant or a gas power plant or whatever. So you can, if you want to, you can think about where exactly you go for your green hosting. So, for example, I had a client recently who's chose to have their hosting done in Iceland because it has one of the lowest carbon intensities of a national grid of anywhere in Europe. So they can still have their website hosted within the EU, but on a very low carbon intensity grid. The other thing that I always recommend is really useful is to use something like a content delivery network, which you can normally set up very easily for your website, which basically is a system of servers local to where your users are, so that they get a copy of your website from a server that's very close to them. So the distance that the information has to travel from place to place is greatly reduced, rather than all being held in one server, say for example in the UK, and someone's accessing it from Singapore or whatever. If they are in Singapore, they get a copy direct from Singapore. And there's options for this now as well that run on either 100% renewable energy in countries where that's available, or offset in countries where it's not. So that's also a good option as well.
Wonderful, thanks ever so much for that. And there's a data centre based here in Manchester that's trialling the use of hydrogen fuel cells, and obviously with the caveat that needs to be green hydrogen, could start to be an interesting solution there. So just coming over to you then, Pete, on that kind of, that hardware question. I mean, I don't even want to guess how many laptops GFT must own, but presuming that is a high number, have you got strategies in place kind of internally for how you manage that hardware and the kind of end of life of that? And is that a real concern now for clients?
It is for us and our people. I don't think our clients are probably concerned about their own hardware rather than what we do with ours, if I'm honest with you. It's a nice message to give them that we don't just send stuff to landfill, which hopefully most companies are moving away from, because even if you there's plenty of options, right? And one of my previous companies, for example, used to donate them to relative charities in the local areas for their offices or nationally and stuff like that. So there's always a way to reuse tech hardware. I was watching an interesting video about this actually a little while ago, and it said actually that 80% of the sort of the carbon cost of a mobile phone, for example, just comes from the manufacturer alone. So the actual creation of that device is far more damaging than the use of it for its lifetime. So if you can donate devices, if you can repair devices, if you can give them a second lease of life, that's obviously a really, really important thing, rather than just, or if you can, buy secondhand devices rather than brand new as well, and recycle rather than buy new, that's definitely beneficial. But again, I think for us, what we do with our devices, a bit like our approach to anything on sustainability, our people care about it. So it's only right that we care about it as a company, and we try and improve what we're doing. So yeah, I think charitable donations are a great idea if all recycling. There's different ways to use old tech. Could I also there was a question just while we were talking about cloud storage from Suzanne in chat. I don't know if we're going to work back through the questions.
No, jump in as they're coming through. That's absolutely fine.
Cool. So Suzanne asked the question: Is cloud storage options differ? How do we find out the most efficient and greenest option? And Colin, I don't know what your views on this, but for me, it's kind of you've got to go and do the homework. Unfortunately, there's not an easy way to do it at the minute. And
the other problem, you have to take the supplier at face value, because, as we said, that there are no standards. There's no real third-party checks that you can rely on. There are companies that advertise that they do offer 100% green hosting, or that it's off strictly renewable energy and stuff. But you just have to take that's the way it is. And it's, as Pete says, you just need to have a look around and see what options are out there.
And that's kind of one of the real challenges at the moment, is it where some of the other industries are getting a lot better at actually being like, there's a standard and we can share this information. Or for something like travel, the car manufacturers will have to give you that information. You can start to track, different methods of public transport and kind of cars against each other. But that just isn't there for a lot of the tech. And even when you look at, saying like 80% of that being in the manufacture, that information isn't there. If I decide that I want to buy a new phone, nobody's telling me what the carbon footprint is of that device, or how easy it is to replicate it, to refurbish it, or to recycle it. So if I'm buying something and thinking, I'm going to buy this, how long is it going to last for? How easy is it to repair? How easy is it to update? So we know for kind of the big white goods, and there's kind of the right to repair rules that are going to be coming in to make that a lot easier. But unless I've missed it, that really doesn't seem to cover things like mobile phones, laptops, to make them easier to be able to repair and update.
Yeah. So I think, and there's a great point from Helen in chat there about the green claims code, which is around making sure that if you claim something is green, it has to be truthful and factual and all. And that's good. But I think, how do I say I don't trust people? I think
seems to be a really high mark, doesn't it? If people get pulled up on that code, it tends to be based like it was an outright lie, and that's not okay. There seems to be a lot underneath. I think
the thing about the green claims code is it's kind of like, if you say something, you've got to be able to prove it, but it doesn't say that you have to say something. So if you went back to the analogy of the washing machine, sort of, the standard on a washing machine or a TV, the energy use of the physical electronic device, if you apply that in the digital world, I think, and again, you've got to trust people, right? But at least it would have a standard that we could actually, and I think for mass consumers, right, because as intelligent as individuals are, as groups of people, we are less intelligent, let's say, and we'll follow the herd. And we need simple things, right? We need to just have really simple indicators that, I should buy device A because device B has taken up twice as much energy to make it and 3 times as much to use on a day-to-day basis. So we've got to keep it really, really simple and have something that's prominent in people's face, I think, when it comes to trying to help people make better decisions.
Absolutely. And I think as well, when we look at those claims, there's a huge difference between making a really clear claim on something and using that kind of very open language of, we're more sustainable, like we're reducing our carbon footprint, we're doing this. You can make some fairly vague statements that they're not incorrect, like they're not going to fall foul of that. But as a consumer, I'm like, well, what does that actually mean? But yeah, having that kind of standard really clear. And I've seen it was a restaurant in Dublin have started doing that. Actually, they put the carbon footprint on the menu. So if you're making your choice of what you want to eat, and is it, a beef burger, is it a kind of meat substitute burger, what the difference is. And, we're only just getting to the point now where we're putting calories on all of the menus at the moment, and that's obviously a huge challenge for the hospitality industry to do. It's probably not the right time for us to be like, and also we'd like to see carbon footprints on everything, but actually having that kind of standard that people can see quite visibly that can help us to make those choices would definitely be a positive. Wonderful. So I'm going to open up to Q&A now. Either, as I say, if you want to pop it in the chat function, or if you just raise a hand as a Zoom response reaction, I think they're called. If you raise your hand on there, then I can come to you and you can ask your question. I'm just going to have, I think as these have been coming through, we've covered pretty much everything on the discussion.
There's a couple further up that we've missed.
A couple further up. Carbon footprint of search engines. Ecosia planting trees. I have to say that is the one that I use, mainly because it makes me feel good that it tells me it's planting trees, rather than from any real in-depth research done on that. Is one better than the other? Should we all switch to Ecosia?
So Ecosia runs on, it's basically Bing, so it's Microsoft Bing. It's the same search engine, that's just packaged slightly differently, so it's no more or less efficient than that, but it does have the advantage that they do plant trees. So that's useful.
And I can see here planting those trees right here in Manchester, which is wonderful. We love a good tree in Manchester. Wonderful. Other question come further up is around blockchain in renewable energy trading. Not expecting either of you to be experts on this subject. Pete, I'm guessing it might fall more into your remit than Colin's.
Colin, sure you don't want to take this one, Colin? It's
crack on. Tell us what you've got.
Right, so yeah, I'm not an expert in blockchain or crypto, but or green energy trading, but essentially to sort of really strip it right back, blockchain, the technology is a block and a chain, right? So it's a block of data and a link to the next block of data. And the idea with it is it can be applied to anything where you need essentially a ledger or a record of a transaction. And it's the blocks, once they're created, are immutable, so they can't be changed, they can't be added to. They are a definitive source, single source of truth that's replicated globally, so that it can't be hacked or now can't be hacked is not 100% factually correct, but they're getting better. But it's the best we've got, right? Yeah, it's the best we've got. The way they're used for things like green bonds is that basically it's an asset, so you can essentially more or less guarantee that that asset is green. So a bit like the green code thing, that thing is factually as close as you're going to get to knowing that that is a piece of 100% green, whatever it is. So the idea is you can trade it knowing that it's 100% that asset and nothing else. I'm kind of a bit on the fence on my opinions on it, to be honest with you, if I'm being completely honest. I know my company GFT, we've helped some people with green bonds and things like that. I think it's an emerging technology and process that needs a lot more thought, if I'm completely honest with you. I think there's bigger fish to fry at the minute, but it's an example of a new technology being used for that.
Wonderful, thanks very much for that. And yeah, definitely broke it down in terms that were nice and easy to understand. But I think what it really shows us is technology is moving so quickly, and our interest in sustainability and the urgency of wanting to do something is always pushing on. So when you get something that kind of sits in that crossover, it's like whatever we chat about now, that's going to have jumped on in 12 months' time. That industry is going to look completely different. So I don't envy anybody trying to kind of keep up with that, but really interesting that I think when blockchain first came around and cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, nobody was really talking about the carbon footprint of those industries. You know, we knew they were high energy users, and the issue was that people were jumping on to other companies' supplies and essentially stealing energy to do that, and that there was an issue there, but we weren't really seeing that same thing of going, well, hang on a minute, it's hugely energy intensive. What does that mean here? So really interested to see how quickly that conversation around it has changed. Do we have any other conversations before I get to my final points for Colin and Pete? So the final question that I'd like to finish on, and mainly just because I always like to finish on a positive note. I feel like whenever we go into sustainability, it can start to get fairly depressing and fairly terrifying. For anybody on the call with us today, or anybody watching this back after, if you're going to go back into your business and be like, right, we're going to focus on one thing to make our tech more sustainable, what's the one thing that you like, go and do this first, or find out about this first? Colin, I'll come to you first.
So if we're taking it from the point of view of websites, which is kind of more what I specialise in, it's review the images on your websites. There's some really, really easy wins to reduce the overall file size of your images, and they can be done in a way that your visitors would never even notice. And you can reduce file sizes by sometimes up to 80% with no noticeable loss in quality.
Wonderful, really brilliant, great actionable tip there, and it's definitely something that I'm going to be running back through Elevate's website to have a little check on our images there. Pete, what would be your one action that you would love to see businesses take?
I'll go a little bit more sort of holistic, and I think I'm a big believer in what gets measured gets done at the end of the day, and I think putting more pressure on CEOs, managing directors to make the strategic initiatives out of sustainability and reducing carbon footprints. You know, if it's front and center for a business's priorities, and it's appearing on dashboards, you know, regular KPIs about it, it's going to get a lot more attention, and it should help move the needle. So I would put pressure on the most senior person you've got a channel to, or just go right to the top of your organization. Just email your CEO today and go, we should have a sustainability metric on our company dashboard. I think that'll be awesome, because the more companies that do it, I think the more pressure that will give to central governments to actually drive some standards and some meaningful change there.
Fantastic, I love that. Yeah, absolutely, that pressure coming at the top as being, you know, what are the strategic decisions that we're making? Because what we've quite often found when we've spoken to kind of sustainability leads in organisations, they're often people who've just kind of inherited it. They were active on a sustainability committee and they've been given that role, and it should absolutely sit at that C-suite level. It's the biggest risk for your organisations coming up. There's also some huge opportunities, and we know that, you know, the conversations with employees coming through, if you want to get the best talent and keep them there, that needs to be on your agenda as well. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to Pete and Colin for joining us. I've seen my colleague Catherine has dropped in the chat the links through to your organisations for people to be able to find out a little bit more. I'll also drop your LinkedIn profiles into the follow-up email from this, so if people want to connect, you can do. So yeah, thanks to everybody for joining, and hopefully we'll continue those conversations and put a lot of that into action.